Howdy again. In this brief video, I would like to address the article by Hofstede himself, I think that's how you pronounce it, on cultural dimensions. You might have been, if you read through it already, you might have been a little curious as to why this was specifically included, because although it does talk about education briefly, it's not a major focus of the article. However, I have seen Hofstede's work used in many different aspects as relate to education. One of the most famous ones, those of you who've had class with me before, I know I've talked about the work of bridging cultures, studying differences between Latinx children in California and particularly at the kindergarten level, and the Hofstede's work, which particularly the work on individualism versus collectivism, was a key part of understanding how children, the cultural backgrounds that they bring to school, you can really explain a lot of those distinctions based on that individualist versus collectivist dimension. So I have seen some interesting examples of how it's been used. Most recently, when I taught a course on mixed methods, I had a group that drew from it very heavily to explain, for example, the difference between how women participate in sport across the world. So I've really seen Hofstede's work be a kind of this, the reason I wanted to include it was because it kind of addresses some of the why questions. Like the book, the Linda Darling Hammond book, I think is an excellent resource, but it really kind of lays out, here's why, here's what's happening in Finland, here's what's happening in Singapore, in Victoria, Canada, in Melbourne, Australia. But it doesn't really speculate as to that why question. And I think, although I'm not saying that Hofstede's work is by any means a complete answer, but here's at least some speculation as to why different school systems around the world are the way that they are. And as you know, I'm also a qualitative researcher, and as such, the why questions have always been of great interest to me. So I thought, let me at least introduce you to one possibility as to how, what are some dimensions along which cultures differ. And then maybe although the book doesn't refer to this directly, maybe this is a framework that we can go back to and try to pull from when we see, like, why, for example, are teachers held in such high regard in Shanghai, as they talk about, or why does it seem like there's more individual control, like state control in, like they said, both Canada and Australia have federalist systems of education. Other places are much more central. Maybe we can speculate a little bit as to the why based on these dimensions. So what Hofstede did, and the article I think goes in, he himself explains how he kind of stumbled upon this. And really from the article, when you read it, I'm not worried about whether you really get into his methodology. And I know you might even be thinking, this is IBM and their employees, and how does this have relevance? But as I said, I've seen it applied in a variety of different contexts. So he does a good job, I think, of explaining what culture as the collective programming of mind that distinguishes categories of people from one another. So it's really, because so much of culture is in the mind, I think this, more than any other model that I've seen, has really tried to kind of organize culture along these sort of cognitive dimensions. I was a little disturbed, I will say, about the idea that we program the mind, because that seems to deny people's agency. But I think it does have something to offer. On the other hand, and this may be a question that occurred to some of you, it's always interesting to think about categorizing culture along dimensions. because maybe that the very act of categorization is the act of one particular cultural mindset. So is that still kind of continuing that sort of domination? So that is a question that remains. And there's always, when you start categorizing, and especially when you start giving scores, there does kind of enter this, well, which one's better? And really the question is, can we say that any one culture is better than the other? I mean, does having a 91 make you better? And then, and really, as certainly those of you who have come into contact with multiple international populations and have traveled yourself, might have even thought about, there's so much interconnectedness in the world, that how much do these things really even stand up anymore? But Hofstede, as he explains, he kind of, he looked at various different models and came up with these 6 dimensions on which cultures can differ very greatly from one another, and he assigns many countries scores on this. And they're really interesting, like the idea of power distance, like and on their own website, and that's one that I will encourage you to visit, the hofstedeinsights.com, where there is certainly a commercial aspect to that, but power distance, the extent to which the less powerful members of institutions and organizations within a country expect and accept that power is distributed unequally. And as you can imagine, in the United States, that there's not a lot of adherence to that. What people do expect that power will be distributed more equally, and you'll see that in the scores. To what level do we avoid uncertainty? So which translates to much more centralized control. What about the rights of individuals versus collectivist rights? Like, are we supposed to look out for ourselves the most, or are we more concerned about integrating as part of the group? Masculinity versus femininity. And of course we could definitely argue with some of this. Remember that some of these terms come from the 1980s, and so these terminologies were more acceptable then. But in general, the more that societies kind of identify with quote unquote masculine values, there tends to be more competition. And the more that femininity is a collective value, then there tends to be much stronger of an ethic on care. Does one think long-term versus short-term orientation? Long-term being something like we have a long history, and preserving that history is very important, versus short-term thinking about pretty early on into the future. And then how much do we tend to indulge in our desires? How much do we tend to gratify ourselves, whether that be in the kind of, do we treat ourselves more often, or how much do societies encourage us to have more restraint? And of course, I'd refer you to the reading itself that explains these much better, and also the website that gives you some really interesting connections. And one of the things, if you do choose to comment on this Flipgrid, you might want to do is look at different countries in terms of these orientations, and see if you can come up with what seems to be surprising. Like power distance, like on a scale of 100, the US scores a 41. So in terms of small power distance, in societies where with lower scores, such as the US, the belief is that power should be legitimate and subject to criteria of good and evil. Parents treat children as equals. So basically saying that those who are further from the center of power tend to have more rights is what you're seeing here. Like subordinates expect to be consulted, and as you can see, student-centered education. So the in the large power distance, children are expected to be obedient, and they are expected to learn information, not necessarily participate. in that process. There's hierarchies. They are told what to do. So I think if you see this and look where the U.S. stands in this does kind of help you think about why U.S. education systems are the way they are. Uncertainty avoidance. Also here, you see that the U.S. is slightly higher of a score than for power distance, but there is a certain amount of comfort with ambiguity and chaos. There is a certain amount of tolerance of, and again, very interesting language to use, deviant persons and ideas. Of course, there's a loaded history there, so I'd be very careful about using that language. But they tend to be more, focus on health and well-being, comfort with saying, I don't know, comfort with changing jobs, because there isn't such a strong ethic of, I have to have certainty. Whereas, coming from India, I've certainly, if you got a job, you stayed in that for the rest of your life. You stayed in the same house for the rest of your life. Teachers were supposed to be authority figures. Even if you didn't like your job, you kind of stayed in it because uncertainty, like taking risks, was not something that was really encouraged. And so that very definitely made its way into the school system. So again, I want you to, these are not necessarily absolute dimensions, but I think they're things that you might think of, just think about as we start to analyze why these different school systems around the world, are the way they are. And on individualism versus collectivism, and the U.S. scores the highest as compared to all other countries around the world on a scale to 100. Of 100, scores a 91, taking care of yourself. And that's certainly kind of interestingly something that we're seeing playing out as relating to the coronavirus, and how each community and each family, in a way, even has had to make these decisions, whereas in more collectivist cultures, a lot of decisions have been made from the top. You're seeing people as individuals rather than as members of a community. And then also think about how that translates into classrooms. You expect students to speak their mind, to have opinions. We do things where we let kids vote on policies. We teach them to use the word I. The purpose of education is learning how to learn, not to necessarily to participate. So in a community task. So I hope you see, I haven't, in the video I don't address each of them, but I do encourage you to go on the Hofstede website and look through where the U.S. scores on each one of them, and perhaps leave a comment, because I think that would be really interesting. And my purpose, of course, with all of this is I hope that you'll find that maybe this is a framework on which we can pin some of those why questions. So thanks for your attention, and I will talk to you again soon.